Welcome to The Real News. I'm Jessil Noor. This is part two of our conversation with Micah Uetricht about his new book, Bigger Than Bernie, How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism, which he co-authored with Megan Day. And we're joined again by Micah Uetricht. He's the managing editor of Jacobin, host of the Jacobin radio podcast, The Vast Majority, and a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I wanted to, in this second part, talk about the lessons from local struggles. We know that local politics are the politics that affect us the most, that can have most impact in our day-to-day lives. And that's some of the places where socialists, where the DSA have been most active, helping vault people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, not only into elected office, but in a position to change national discourse. Micah, you wrote about what happened in New York and Chicago, two places where socialists have had more success perhaps than anywhere else. Let's start with New York and what you found. What the main lessons of New York are, and they're ongoing. There's more socialists running for office this year as well.
Obviously, the Bernie campaign was principally about electing Bernie as president of the United States, but it's worth remembering that just 4 years ago, before Bernie's first campaign, there were almost no socialist elected officials anywhere in the United States. I mean, we had Shama Sawant on Seattle City Council and maybe a few others here and there. But there has been a pretty impressive number of victories that socialists have had, ranging from the local to the national level. And we write about New York as a case study in the book, not just to say, oh, look what, some socialists won in New York, but to actually describe how socialists can play an important role as part of a bigger working class coalition in the electoral realm as well as in social movements. And so in New York, the only two socialists who have so far been elected to any kind of office in the state are, of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the House, but also State Senator Julia Salazar. And those victories were important. They're two self-identified socialists. But there was also a broader progressive surge in electoral politics that took place in 2018 that shifted the balance of the New York State Senate and got rid of what was called the IDC, which was a block of Democrats in the state Senate who caucused with Republicans and effectively served to block progressive legislation in the state. And so Julia Salazar's election was part of that wave of displacing the IDC. And the two of them in office, along with the surge in socialism, socialist activism around things like affordable housing in the state of New York and in New York City, helped lead to, again, as part of a broader progressive surge from people who do not consider them as socialists, the fight back against things like Amazon attempting to move into Long Island City in Queens, which was a huge battle that would have displaced huge numbers of working class New Yorkers and also would have given billions in public dollars to Amazon, one of the wealthiest corporations in the world, of course, that really does not need billions in public money. And AOC and Julia Salazar and New York City DSA were all key players in this fight that was, just to reiterate, not solely carried out by socialists, but socialists as part of a broader working class movement. Were able to successfully stop Amazon from moving to Queens. Amazon is moving to New York anyway, but not into Long Island City, moving to Manhattan, and they're not taking the multi-billion-dollar aid package that was prepared to be given to them. And so that's a real victory. That's a significant win that socialists played a key role in New York City. And that's just with a small minority of socialist elected officials in the House and in their state Senate. So, I mean, the important issue is that they were there as, organizing as part of a broader coalition that was not just socialist, it was other progressive working class institutions. But socialists in New York City DSA, beyond just their elected representatives, really played a key role in affecting the sea change around the discourse around affordable housing in New York City. Obviously, we know that there's a real housing crisis in New York City, and DSA helped play the role of demanding that something be done about that, which culminated in some pretty historic rent control and other provisions protecting renters in the city of New York. Far from what is needed, of course, in New York City, but the strongest affordable housing protections that we've seen introduced in New York for a long time. So socialists played a key role in that, and it's something that we can point to show the kind of tangible victories that socialists, along with a broader wave of progressive activism, have actually won.
And you've been reporting in Chicago for a long time, a place of intense class struggle. In the years of Rahm Emanuel, you had the multiple teachers strike there. Now you have same with New York. You have Amazon workers going on strike. You have them protesting. Extreme exploitation and dangerous conditions are being put in. Talk about some of the lessons from Chicago, and especially what you talked about. So the role socialists played in a broader coalition, and the impact they're having. Something like 10% of the city council are now socialists.
Yeah. So there are half a dozen members of the Democratic Socialists of America who are elected to Chicago City Council. But the way that we got to that point starts way back in 2010, when the Chicago Teachers Union had its leadership taken over by a current called the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, which were a group of teachers and other kinds of educators who were committed to democratic militant unionism that was struggling alongside communities that were fighting austerity in the public education system in Chicago, but also across the board. And I bring this up because, for one, there were socialists who, before the Bernie Sanders campaign, were key players in that effort. They weren't the only ones who were involved in taking over the union, but they played this really critical role alongside other people who had a similar vision of what unionism should look like. They went on strike in 2012 and have gone on strike several times since then. And over the course of that past decade, since they took over the union, the CTU has emerged as the anchor of a left-wing politics in this city. And I bring that up just to emphasize how that kind of activism within a union like a teachers union or another municipal union or in a private sector union can play a role in transforming the politics of a city as a whole, because that strike and the way that it changed Chicago politics opened up the space for last year half a dozen socialists to get elected to the Chicago City Council, as well as other progressives who are not members of DSA, but who are part of that broader left-wing bloc that has emerged in Chicago politics. So the case study of Chicago is important to emphasize the interplay between organizing outside of the electoral realm, organizing within a union, and a specific kind of unionism that's a militant and democratic unionism that's fighting for the entire working class. A kind of unionism, which, by the way, it's not a mistake that there were socialists involved in pushing that kind of unionism, because that is the kind of unionism that socialists have long argued for and been the strongest proponents of within the labor movement. So socialists helped play that role in transforming the city through that kind of unionism, and then opened the space for half a dozen DSA members to now be fighting for things like a robust response to COVID-19, one that includes new social democratic measures that actually tend to working class people's needs in Chicago, who are talking about the problems with are not having a rent freeze in the city, who are pushing for a whole slew of measures in the city, left-wing measures that would not exist without this new left-wing bloc. And again, as I mentioned with New York, it did so as part of a broader coalition, a coalition that, by the way, it's important to mention, is willing to work with socialists, that is not scared off by the socialist label that those DSA members have affixed to themselves. The Chicago example is an example of all of these multiple things coming together to play a role in creating a left-wing bloc that is, for the first time in recent memory, actually creating a left-wing pole in Chicago local politics.
And Micah, isn't it true that you talked about CORE, the Caucus of Rank and File Educators? Didn't that start as a reading group around shock doctrine, Naomi Klein's book, which is especially relevant now? I mean, it's been relevant, but especially under the Rahm Emanuel years, where the teachers went on strike during an election year. for Barack Obama, which put, a lot of pressure on him as well. But just having that class consciousness and having that historical consciousness and applying that to the classroom conditions and waging these strikes and winning some real victories for the Black and brown students that are the majority of students in like the third biggest school district in the country.
Yeah, all of that is correct. It's a testament to the power. I mean, as you mentioned, the fact that this group of people just came together around Naomi Klein and her book shows the power of left-wing ideas when they're put in the hands of rank and file militants of a union that can take the lessons from that book and really run with them and figure out how to push back against exactly the kind of thing that Naomi Klein discusses in that book, which is the use of crises by the right wing or by elites to shove austerity down people's throats and a neoliberal agenda down people's throats. So they took that and they ran with the lessons from that book about how to not just identify that was happening to the city of Chicago and its public education system, but also how to fight back against it.
So you also talk about East Bay, where I believe Megan Day, your co-author, chronicled the failed progressive campaign of Jovanka Beckles, an organizer, a council person in Richmond, which is a fascinating city. They had a Green Party mayor. They waged a war against Chevron for polluting its communities. And it's been a host of other progressive reforms we've covered here on the Real News, including paying at-risk potential offenders money, sort of like a stipend to help them, stay out of trouble. But she ran against Buffy Wicks, called the Bernie Slayer, which was a failed campaign, and obviously a lot of these socialist campaigns aren't going to be victorious, even on the left, challenging the democratic machine, which has held power for decades. But talk about the lessons from that. Again, a campaign that was based on a widespread coalition of working people, unions, and the lessons learned from that.
The Jovanka Beckles campaign, I don't live in the East Bay, but I got to see it in motion when I visited once. And the East Bay DSA really threw themselves into this state assembly race for this candidate, Jovanka. And we detail in the book, I mean, the campaign DSA was the principal player in this campaign, which is different from some of the campaigns like AOC's or some of the socialist elected officials in Chicago who were DSA members but also came out of unions or community groups or whatever. Jovanka Beckles' campaign was principally an East Bay DSA effort, along with folks like you mentioned, the Richmond Progressive Alliance. And it was incredible just to see that this group, DSA, that had just come together, after Bernie's 2016 campaign, all of a sudden was figuring out how to do the nuts and bolts of electoral politics, run a real credible campaign. And they really went all out for this campaign. You could see it when you were in East Bay at the time. Jovanka Beckles signs were all over Oakland and in parts of the district she would have covered. She lost to Buffy Wicks, who was the state director in California for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And yes, she did earn that nickname, Buffy the Bernie Slayer. She lost. It was crushing to people who had thrown their whole lives into that campaign, of course. But the infrastructure that was built from that campaign was then used by East Bay DSA to engage in other kinds of campaigns that were not electorally related. The most immediate one was support of the Oakland teacher strike that happened shortly after Jovanka's campaign. And again, DSA, East Bay DSA, played this key role in mobilizing support for that teacher strike, as well as some members were actually members of the Oakland Education Association. And so they were rank and file organizers for the strike. And so it's an example of, and the book features all kinds of, fun and inspiring details about, DSA members getting up at 6 a.m. and being in these flying squadrons that would be driving all around Oakland, figuring out where, reinforcement on picket lines were needed the most, engaging in, making the signs for the big mass marches that would happen, I was also there right before the strike, and going restaurant to restaurant, putting up signs that said that we support Oakland teachers at local businesses and restaurants and stuff. So it's incredible. Again, just as they built this enormous apparatus basically from nothing, very few people in East Bay DSA had any experience in electoral politics, but they built up this entire electoral campaign to support Jovanka Beckles. They lost in that campaign, but they then used that infrastructure to support this teacher strike that was part of the the teacher strike wave that kicked off in 2018 with the red states like West Virginia and Arizona that we heard so much about, but it also spread to cities like Oakland in I believe January 2019. So it's an example of how electoral politics can be used, not just to try to elect good left-wing and socialist elected officials, but it can also be used to take all of that infrastructure and then support other kinds of grassroots struggles like a union fight, like a teacher strike. And that kind of interplay between electoral campaign that talks about class struggle, that talks about fighting the capitalist class. You can use that infrastructure and sort of seamlessly put it into the kind of worker-led struggle on the job. That's crucial, and that's that kind of we need to be able to do both. The socialist movement that's emerging in the United States has been focused on doing both, engaging on both of those tracks, both the electoral realm and the grassroots organizing realm, which is important to talk about because grassroots organizing, bottom-up union militancy and other kinds of bottom-up organizing are often held in contrast somehow to electoral organizing, that you can choose to do one or the other. And the example of DSA in places like East Bay over the last few years shows that you can actually do both if you go about your organizing the right way.
Well, that wraps up part 2 of our conversation. We still got one more part to go. Thank you so much for joining us, Micah Uetricht.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us at the Real News Network. We'll post all 3 parts of this interview at therealnews.com. We know that everyone's quarantined at home and you need some good book recommendations. So we're going to start interviewing some authors of some great books that'll give you something helpful and hopeful to read while we're all locked down. Thank you for joining us at the Real News Network.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.